So I've been thinking, how come bad people exist? And how come sometimes I'm one of them? Alright, so usually we would want to start with defining our terms. But I don't really think that's going to be possible with this one. We can at least get some placeholders going, right? So that we can at least sound like we know what we're talking about. Let's start with the most difficult, good. For the sake of our conversation, we're going to go with Aristotle's definition of good, eudaimonia. Eudaimonia is happiness, contentment, and fulfillment. It's the name of the best kind of life, which is an end in itself and a means to live and fare well. Eudaimonia is sometimes translated as happiness, and I think this does exactly no justice to what Aristotle would have actually meant by it. By that I mean, the way that you and I say the word happiness is probably not at all what Aristotle meant to be communicating. He meant something more like the ideal life, the best possible life. So what's nice about this definition is not just informed by how we live in the present, but it can be informed by retrospect in our legacy that we leave behind. This is nice because it avoids the objection that maybe in the future people will look back at our present actions, and even though we think that they're morally good and that they promoted the best possible life, they actually weren't. They were in contradiction to the best possible life. So eudaimonia will be a placeholder for the optimum good, the best life, whatever kind of life that is. We'll have to stop short of having a further conversation of what kind of life that is, but I think we can still extrapolate a definition of vice and virtue. A virtue, we might say, is any subject's behavior that promotes eudaimonia, while a vice is any subject's behavior that prevents or hinders us from arriving at eudaimonia. Virtues are any behavior that make our lives more similar to the best of all possible lives, and vices are any behavior that makes our life less similar to the best of all possible lives. I should be clear too that for the sake of our conversation, vice and virtue is synonymous with morally good and morally bad actions. Now, a model like this might be critiqued by someone like Immanuel Kant because it sounds like consequentialism. And while I think if we wanted to, we could save our definition from being strictly consequentialist since we haven't quite defined what we think a behavior is and what eudaimonia is, nevertheless, I think it's important that we understand what consequentialism is. Consequentialism is the view that morality is all about producing the right kinds of overall consequences. It's a school of thought that says the moral content of an action should be judged entirely based on the consequences that flow from that action. So from the act of watering, we should first consider whether it is that the water will fall on a flower, which is probably good, or if it's going to fall on a cat, which might be less than good. So there is some intuitive appeal to this, but my goodness, haven't you ever heard of the butterfly effect? I mean, how could I possibly comprehend all of the consequences that are going to come from a single action? So suppose some guy in the past saved a small child from drowning. That seems like a good thing, except turns out that that small child was Hitler. Do we now have to say that the act of saving a child from drowning is morally reprehensible in some situations, namely if the child was Hitler? Well, you might want to say that it was his moral duty to save the child from drowning. And if you do, that's going to be in contradiction to consequentialism. This brings us to our next theory, deontological theory. In contrast to consequentialist theories, deontological theories judge the morality of choices by criteria different from the states of affairs those choices bring about. That no matter how morally good their consequences, some choices are morally forbidden. You can see that they vary in having either an external or an internal focus, whether what comes from my action with the external world, the consequences of it, or if we're concerned about what happens individually, what happens inside of me when I obey a moral duty. Now, where these moral duties would come from or how we come to know what they are would all need to be accounted for, but these are things that we'll have to deal with later. But for our purposes, you can see, hopefully, in the way that we define eudaimonia as being an ideal life, that either one of these would be comparable. Because you could say the ideal life produces the best consequences, or you could say that an ideal life abides by the moral duties. And so from that, let's look back at our definition of vices and virtues. We said that a vice or a virtue has to do with a person's behavior, but what exactly does it take to be considered your behavior? What we want to avoid is the possibility of just happening to have performed a morally good behavior. There seems to be an intuitive distinction between accidents and what we happen to be doing and an actual moral decision, what we should get credit for. The most common example of an involuntary action is when a doctor taps your knee and causes it to kick. Why do we call that involuntary? It's your body that's done something, right? Well, I would say it's because there's a mismatch between your will and what your body has done. Namely, that you had no intention to move your knee and yet it moved. And so in the case of moral behaviors, it might be possible for us to say that it's only your behavior if you had the proper intentions. Whatever it was, you have to have the proper alignment between what your body does and what you intended to be doing. If your intentions did not properly correspond to your body's movement, then you don't get credit for the morally relevant act. But what way need they correspond? I mean, it's tempting to put all of the focus on our intentions. But suppose I had the best intentions, like say maybe I wanted to cure you of the flu because I care about you and I had very noble desires, but my knowledge of how to do so consisted of opening up one of your veins down on your leg somewhere to allow the proper blood to flow, getting bad blood out of your body. Does the real world consequences of my actions, even under the best intentions, somehow prevent me from doing something that's virtuous? Does my own ignorance prevent me from doing a virtuous act? We're going to have to stop short of actually answering that, but I think we can get at our opening question with what we've discussed so far. What we need to agree on for the moment is simply that there is a distinction between man as he happens to be and man as he could be. If we can agree on this much, then we can ask the question, how come sometimes I am not what I know I could be? That is, we acknowledge there's a distinction between the way I am and what my ideal life is, and yet I don't find myself living ideally. Aristotle would say that there's 3 areas that we're going wrong. Maybe we just don't actually know what the ideal life is, and so we don't know how to get there. We might have some intuition that, yeah, there's probably some way better to live than the way I'm living, but I've got no idea what it is. Or maybe we do have a conception of what the ideal life is, except we don't know how to get from where we are now to there. There's a transitional step missing. In the case of our earlier example, I know that vaccinations are a better treatment for the flu than bloodletting, and yet if it were up to me to create a vaccination to cure the flu, we would be SOL, because I've got no idea how to do that. So that could be the second part that we're going wrong. But there's a third part, and that has to do with practice or experience. In the same way that we don't expect a violinist to read all the books possible about violin and then suddenly pick up a violin for the first time and play Flight of the Bumblebee. That's just something missing. There's an intimate, particular knowledge missing from her experience. We may be ignorant of the good, ignorant of how to arrive at the good, or ignorant of particular knowledge that we can only gain through experience. Hopefully we can see by now that sorting out what we should consider to be morally good is not very straightforward. But I can't go any further without at least introducing you to a view that I think is fascinating. It's that of many religions. It's a position that says the universe, at least according to its original design, was such that a man's moral duties, what we perceived internally to be the right thing to do, was synonymous with the action that produced the best possible consequences, and that disunity only came along later in the line. Now, of course, they would have to offer up reasons for that disunity and why it's no longer the case, so obviously no longer the case that our moral duties always produce the best consequences, but I do think that this is a fascinating position that one could take. Coming back to our opening question, it seems that ignorance of some feature of the universe seems to be what's stopping us. I mean, maybe I don't know what's good, so even with the best intentions, I'm shooting at the wrong mark. Or maybe I see what I think should be good, but I don't have any idea how to get there. Or maybe I just lack the first-hand experience, the practice to do so that when push comes to shove, even though I know how and I know what, I just don't actually perform under those situations. So if ignorance is the biggest problem, maybe, and obviously you might not like this coming from a philosophically minded, it may seem obvious, but maybe the best move towards becoming a better person, a good, decent human being, is applying yourself to think about it for a little while. Decide what it is you think and learn some stuff. Maybe we should be a little bit afraid of ignorance. Maybe that's what's keeping us from being a good person.